It's bleak here in Washington, Marjorie. It's very bleak.
Well, it's pretty nice here in San Diego, I have to say.
I'll come visit you.
Also for Nathan.
We're live. Good afternoon to my fellow East Coasters, and good morning to my friends on the West Coast. My name is Chip Gibbons, and I am the Policy Director of Defending Rights in Dissent, a national civil liberties organization that defends your right to know and freedom to act through grassroots mobilization, policy expertise, public education, and advocacy journalism. On January the 3rd, 2026, the United States military, in an operation led by the Delta Force, invaded Venezuela, killed the presidential guard Nicolas Maduro, and kidnapped him and his wife. This came on the 36th anniversary of the arrest, in quotation marks, of Manuel Noriega and 6-year anniversary of Trump's assassination of Iranian General Soleimani. Maduro and his wife have been taken to New York City, where they are indicted with a narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, and I believe the most perplexing charges, possession of machine guns and conspiracy to possess machine guns. Our libertarian gun friends must be very concerned right now. There have been we know from a fact that there have been various death counts coming out of this attack. The U.S., I believe, has assessed that 74 people were killed. This includes both Venezuelan security officials, Cuban security officials, and civilians. And we've seen terrible and horrific graphic pictures of the civilian death in Venezuela. The raid or invasion, whatever you want to call it, followed a dramatic buildup in the Caribbean where it was clear the U.S. was on the cusp of a war. In spite of this, Congress failed on 4 occasions to pass war powers resolutions, either ones limiting a regime change war, preventing a regime change war, or stopping Trump's extrajudicial killings of people on alleged drug boats. The Trump administration had claimed their operations were about drug enforcement. Critics charged they were about regime change in oil. Trump has now made clear openly and explicitly his critics are correct. This is a regime change operation to steal Venezuela's oil. To discuss the Constitution and international law questions posed by this action, we are joined today by Marjorie Cohen. Marjorie is a longtime friend of Defending Rights in Dissent. We have turned to for analysis on the Julian Assange extradition, the Trump indictments, the boat killings, and the legality of U.S. sanctions. Marjorie, I must note, is Professor Emerita at Thomas Jefferson School of Law and former president of the National Lawyers Guild. She is a columnist for Truth Out, and her recent piece in Truth Out is Trump will try to defend aggression towards Venezuela. It's still illegal. Marjorie, thank you for joining us again.
Thanks for having me, Chip.
So we're going to talk about international law in a moment and how it relates to the U.S. Constitution, but let's start with the U.S. Constitution. We know there were four failed votes to invoke the War Powers Act, including one just weeks before the invasion. But Trump's invasion was not authorized by Congress, and a number of the Republican members who voted against the last War Powers resolution justified it both by saying we weren't currently in hostilities with Venezuela or imminent hostilities, and that Rubio and Hegseth, 2 very reliable people, told the Congress they did not have a legal case for launching war and were not preparing to do so. Now that Trump has actually done this, we're being told that since there was an indictment, this was lawful, or it's a law enforcement operation, not a war. What does the Constitution say about this? Did Trump violate the Constitution's War Powers Clause?
Well, the Constitution, Article 1, gives Congress and only Congress the power to declare war. And under Article 2, the president is the commander-in-chief. So once Congress declares war, then the president is in command of the forces to carry out the U.S. part of the war. Also, the Constitution has what is called in Article 6, the Supremacy Clause, which says that treaties shall be the supreme law of the land and they bind all judges. So international law, ratified treaties, customary international law are part of U.S. law. So Chip, when people say, oh, that's international law, that's not U.S. law, international law is U.S. law. When the U.S. has ratified a treaty, such as the UN Charter, which we're going to talk about today, and and customary international law, which is not codified by a treaty, but which grows in response to the general practice of states. And the U.S. courts have said in no uncertain terms that customary international law is part of federal common law.
And that goes back to the early years of the country. I mean, I believe the first Congress passed a tort remedy under customary international law. And the Supreme Court, I think, was 1801 when they said that customary international law was part of federal common law. So that's not some activist judge in the last 10 years, activist judge I use facetiously. So, I mean, one of the arguments that the executive branch makes is that they can use military force if it is in the national interest, this is without congressional authorization, if it's in the national interest and if it's not a war in the constitutional sense. And since Nixon's illegal bombing of Cambodia, the executive branch lawyers in the Office of Legal Counsel have never once found that something rose to the level of a war in the constitutional sense. And this is just baffling to me because it seems like if somebody invaded the United States and kidnapped Donald Trump, I don't terribly like Donald Trump, but, if there are 150, Russian helicopters over my apartment building bombing things, I would say we're at war in the constitutional sense. And you have these opinions where you have things like the U.S. can bomb another country for 70 or 100 days, targeting television stations, subway or public transportation, and it's not war in the constitutional sense. What do you make of that argument as a law professor?
Well, Chip, keep in mind that OLC, Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice, their opinions do not constitute law. The treaties that U.S. has ratified do constitute law. So the UN Charter says very specifically in Article 2 that no country can use military force against another country unless in self-defense or with the blessing of the Security Council. And that UN Charter doesn't distinguish between war and no war and hostilities and no hostilities. They talk about military force, and the U.S. is bound by the UN Charter. Now, one of the arguments that Donald Trump is going to invariably make when this goes to court, and of course, that was a Freudian slip, President Maduro is going to raise in his defense that this was an unlawful kidnapping, and he is correct. One of the defenses that the Trump administration is going to use to that argument by Maduro is a 1989 opinion by the Office of Legal Counsel, then Assistant Attorney General Bill Barr. And that particular opinion says that the FBI has authority to arrest somebody in another country, that the president can lawfully order an extraterritorial, that means in another country, arrest, even if it violates customary international law and violates the sovereignty of another country. And it also says that the take care clause of the Constitution, it's take care clause of the Constitution, which I should have mentioned before, says that the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And therefore, it's up to the president to enforce laws that Congress has enacted and treaties, etc. And that that allows him, the take care clause, this is what this memo says, the take care clause allows him to make arrests in other countries, even if it violates customary international law. This particular opinion, and I think most outrageously, says that domestic law in the United States, in other words, the authority to go into another country and arrest someone, trumps, no pun intended, trumps the UN Charter. And that's absolute hogwash. And then finally, it says that a U.S. arrest in another country doesn't violate the Fourth Amendment's prohibition against unreasonable searches and seizures. Now, keep in mind, Chip, that this 1989 memo, which I guarantee the Trump administration is going to use when it counters Maduro's arguments that it was an illegal kidnapping, this opinion by the OLC has never been upheld by the Supreme Court. And most reliable and eminent scholars have said that it is pure hogwash. But this is what the Trump administration is going to rely on.
I mean, and that's true. I think a lot of the OLC opinions when it comes to war powers. I mean, since Nixon's invasion of Cambodia, they have produced opinion after opinion that these actions are lawful. And I don't know any serious scholar. I mean, there's, people at the Heritage Foundation probably think this is great, but I don't know if you'd call them serious, Marjorie. But I don't know like any serious scholar who has embraced any of these theories. And it's very clear that a lot of what goes on at the OLC, at least with foreign policies, they rubber stamp what the executive wants to do. Maybe there's other areas where they don't. But when you tell us that bombing Yugoslavia, bombing Libya, invading Panama, invading Grenada aren't wars in the constitutional sense, it's just nonsensical. It's interesting you used the word kidnapping. I would note that the journalist Owen Jones has obtained a memo from BBC barring journalists from describing this as a kidnapping. However, when Trump was asked on Air Force One about the Venezuelan vice president, interim president Delcy Rodriguez calling it kidnapping, he said, "That's all right. It's not a bad term." So Trump agrees with you. This is a kidnapping. So we don't really know what's happening on the ground in Venezuela right now. There's a lot of lack of clarity, including about whether or not there were elements of the current government that cooperated with the U.S. in abduction of Maduro. Some people insist there were. Some people insist that's propaganda or a psychological operation designed to divide the country. I have no clue. But Trump has insisted he's going to run the country. We have no clue what that really means. We don't know if we're going to send Marco Rubio to be the viceroy, or if it's as Rubio said, we're just going to have an oil embargo and threats of violence. We do know that Trump has said of the interim president, if she doesn't do what's right, she's going to pay a very big price, probably bigger than Maduro. Reuters also has a report out that we're targeting the interior minister of Venezuela, and that the Trump administration has communicated to Cabello, that's the interior minister, via intermediaries, that if he is, I'm quoting Reuters right now, that if he is defiant, he could face a similar fate to Maduro. Again, I'm quoting Reuters. The authoritarian leader captured in a U.S. raid on Saturday and whisked away to New York to face prosecution on narco-terrorism charges, or could see his life in danger, the source said. Rubio has also issued demands on Venezuela. They have to cut ties of China, Russia, Iran, Cuba, economic ties, and they have to agree exclusively with U.S. on oil production and favor America when selling heavy crude oil. What is the legality of all of this under international law, both from just taking over the oil or allowing the remnants of the current government to remain in power, but with this implicit threat of force that will kill or kidnap you if you don't sever ties with Cuba, if you don't give us your oil, etc.? Is this lawful under international law?
No, the UN Charter prohibits the threat of force or the use of force against another country, and these are threats that they're making, so they also violate the UN Charter. One of the things that I thought was really outrageous, and this is an example of the tail wagging the dog, was when Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was participating in the press conference after the invasion. He and Rubio and Trump and Hegseth explaining what they had done. He said that when the U.S. military was leaving after having kidnapped Maduro, he didn't use the word kidnap, he said that they engaged in multiple self-defense engagements as the force began to withdraw out of Venezuela. I mean, it's an illegal invasion. It violates the UN Charter. And then when the Venezuelans fight back, which is their lawful right, because under Article 51 of the UN Charter, after an armed attack, a state can fight back in self-defense. It's Venezuela that had the right to self-defense, not the United States. So you can't launch an illegal invasion and then, when the people lawfully fight back in the invaded country, then you argue self-defense. Again, the tail wagging the dog. Now, what the Trump administration did in its invasion, in its attack on Venezuela, constitutes illegal aggression under international law. And at Nuremberg, illegal aggression was called the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole. So we're talking about, for example, the International Criminal Court, which prosecutes war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and now aggression in limited instances. Aggression is the supreme international crime. And that's what the Trump administration did in Venezuela. Trump attempted to justify his aggression by saying that Maduro was the kingpin of this drug operation. But keep in mind that an assessment by U.S. intelligence agencies in February of 2025 concluded that Tren de Aragua, which is one of the groups that this indictment is alleging that Maduro is the head of, was neither controlled by the Venezuelan government nor committing crimes on its orders. And most of the cocaine, and the indictment has to do with cocaine, most of the cocaine coming into the United States does not travel through the Caribbean, but through the Pacific. And Venezuela does not have a Pacific coast. Trump said, and as you mentioned, that he intends to take over Venezuela's oil and sell it to other countries because it belongs to the United States or U.S. corporations. The U.S. has never owned Venezuela's oil or territory. Even if it were true that the U.S. owns Venezuela's oil, which is not true, that would not provide a legal basis for Trump's illegal aggression. Rubio put forth still a different rationale, which I think you mentioned, and said, well, this is largely a law enforcement operation. But a state, which is a country in international law, has no enforcement jurisdiction in the territory of another state unless that second state gives its consent. Otherwise, it violates that second state's sovereignty. Moreover, under customary international law, Maduro has head of state immunity from foreign enforcement jurisdiction, and this is going to be one of his defenses. Now, the U.S. withdrew recognition of him as the president of Venezuela. That, however, does not negate Maduro's personal immunity under customary international law, and these are defenses that he will raise.
Can we dive into that a bit?
I want to mention.
Could we dive into that a bit? Because, I mean, the Trump administration is going to say that Maduro lost an election and stayed in power afterwards. Whether we think that's true or not is a different question. I'm not, debating Maduro, good guy, bad guy. They're going to say he's an illegitimate dictator. They're going to say he's the head of a narco cartel, Cartel de los Sols, although they have largely dropped that from the second indictment. I mean, how do you respond to those claims that he's not a head of state? He is whatever sort of sloganeering they're doing this. And I know it's very bad faith by the Trump administration, but as an expert under international law, could you explain how one might push back on some of those claims?
Well, until he was kidnapped from his bedroom on January 3rd, or the early morning hours of January 3rd or January 2nd, Nicolás Maduro was the president of Venezuela. Now, there are claims that the election was not lawful in 2024, but there is also evidence that there was a cyber attack, that there were votes that were not counted, that perhaps the CIA was involved in that. And not only that, it is not up to the United States to decide that an election in another country was not free and fair. What if another country said, there are not free and fair elections in the U.S., that they cheat, and therefore we're going to go in and engineer regime change.
After Bush maybe.
Yeah, exactly. And I want to mention regime change. Forcible regime change is illegal. It was illegal in Iraq. And it's illegal now. And also, the U.S. has a history of engineering and supporting illegal coups that overturn democratically elected presidents. The U.S. did it in Iran, in Chile, in Guatemala, and of course in Iraq with Saddam Hussein. Now, forcible regime change violates the UN Charter, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The U.S. has ratified the first two of those treaties because they protect the right of peoples to self-determination. And the first sentence of Article 1 of both of those covenants says, all peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. So yes, this was illegal under international law. And also, I want to keep in mind that Trump has basically admitted that the U.S. is going to occupy Venezuela. He says, we're going to run the country. And this would be an illegal occupation. The International Court of Justice, which is the legal arm of the UN, the highest court in the world, has said that an occupation that is mounted by an illegal seizure of territory that violates the UN Charter is an illegal occupation. So there are several violations of international law, violation of the UN Charter's prohibition on the use of force, forcible regime change, illegal occupation, and illegal kidnapping of a head of state from another country.
And can an occupying power lawfully take the occupied resources? If we are occupying Venezuela, could we lawfully take the oil under what does international law say about that?
Well, the Geneva Conventions, another treaty the U.S. has ratified, says in no uncertain terms that the occupier cannot take the resources of the occupied. They say that an occupation is a temporary situation, not a permanent situation. That's assuming that it's a lawful occupation, which, as I said, this one is not. And there are some parallels between this and Israel occupying Palestinian territory, although it's a bit different. The International Court of Justice said said recently, reiterated that that Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territory is illegal. And also, another thing that they said is that Israel, and this is in 2004, the International Court of Justice, the World Court, said that Israel does not have the right to self-defense because as occupier, it does not have a right to self-defense against the people it occupies. Its duty toward the people it occupies is one of protection. It has to protect them. And, you hear this all the time. Israel acted in self-defense. Israel acted in self-defense. But the World Court has said, no, Israel does not have the right to self-defense. And the World Court has also said that there's a plausible case of genocide going on in the occupied Palestinian territory.
So we only have a few minutes left. I'm gonna wrap this up in a little bit. We started with U.S. constitutional law. Let's end with U.S. constitutional law. I believe there's going to be a war powers vote tomorrow in the Senate around a Senate war powers resolution that would hopefully block further aggression. And the House, there's one war powers resolution that's been introduced. Another one has just been introduced again today. I haven't had time to read them both, but I assume they're fairly similar. We're going to hear the argument that there is no legal basis for invoking the war powers resolution because we're not in hostilities or imminent hostilities. This was a very limited operation. It's over, whatever. How does the fact that Trump has threatened a second wave of strikes, threatened to occupy the country, threatened to run the country, threatened to force the current interim president, the de facto leader, Rodriguez, to pay a higher price than Maduro if she doesn't get in line? He has said we're not afraid to put boots on the ground. How should that impact the debate about whether or not there are hostilities or imminent hostilities in Venezuela right now?
Well, Chip, this is the time for Congress to stand up and enforce the War Powers Resolution. And the text of the War Powers Resolution that is going to be voted on says, and I quote, Congress hereby directs the president to terminate the use of United States armed forces for hostilities within or against Venezuela unless explicitly authorized by a declaration of war or specific authorization for the use of military force. And that would be called an AUMF, authorization for the use of military force. Congress has not declared war on Venezuela. Congress has not passed an authorization for the use of military force. And therefore, this has been illegal, and continued hostilities against Venezuela would also be illegal. I mean, it just defies common sense. It defies logic to say that the U.S. did not commit hostilities when 150 aircraft went in and bombed and killed 75, 80 people, including civilians, but nevertheless, whoever they were, illegally killed them. And some, although Trump very proudly said that, or Hegseth at that press conference, that no Americans were killed, as if they didn't say anything about Venezuelans or Cubans. American lives are exceptional, of course, we know. But there were injuries. There are members of the American military that were injured and that are in the hospital. That is hostilities. There's no other way to define it. And so if Congress is going to conduct its constitutional duty, and the War Powers Resolution was passed by Congress after the Vietnam War because they wanted to have input and make decisions under their constitutional authority to conduct war and armed interventions. If they're worth anything, Congress will pass this this War Powers Resolution and tie Trump's hands against further aggression against the people of Venezuela.
And for people watching at home right now, under Marjorie under me as well, under your screen, you see a URL, tinyurl.com/stoptrumpswar. If you follow that URL, it will take you to a joint action. Defending Rights and Dissent is doing with other groups, including Demand Progress. And if you can contact your senators and tell them to vote yes. The last vote in the Senate, the last vote in the House was extremely close. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me. They were razor-thin margins. We really, really have a shot at passing this and halting further war, but it's going to take all of us putting pressure on the Congress. We're afraid Fetterman might flip-flop again. Collins has voted incorrectly several times. She's once again pondering. I think she's had a lot of outrage from her constituents. So I am really hoping that we can prevent Trump's war further, especially since, I don't think this was good faith, but a number of Republicans said the last time they wouldn't vote on it because Trump wouldn't do this. Well, he's done it now, and it's ongoing. This is not a one-off mission. We're threatening second strikes and to take out other government officials if they don't cooperate in severing ties with Cuba or turning over all their oil. So please take the time right now, tinyurl.com/stoptrumpswar. Let's end this war. Let's stop Trump from waging another one. Marjorie, I know you have to go. It was a pleasure to be joined by you. The last time we spoke was just a month ago about the boat strikes in the Caribbean. I hope to see you soon, but not talking about a new atrocity. Hopefully something else. Maybe Hegseth's impeachment. We can talk about that next time, hopefully.
Thanks, Chip. It was a pleasure.
Always a pleasure.